Welcome back. You're watching HFO-TV.
Let's give a warm welcome to Jared Kadry.
Well, I want to first and foremost thank everyone at Multifamily Northwest for having me today. It's always a pleasure to come back to Portland. I've been spending a lot more time in Seattle, and this presentation is actually going to compare the two markets because I know a lot of people definitely have interests in both markets, and they're very similar in some ways, but very different in others, which we'll go over. And just general guideline throughout the presentation, you're going to be seeing a lot of multifamily data thrown at you. And basically what this is going to cover is market rate properties with 5 or more units. And it's going to cover the Portland Metro as well as the Seattle Metro. So it'll include a lot of the outlying areas. When I talk a little bit about the regulatory landscape, we will specifically be talking about the city of Portland and the city of Seattle, which both have measures that are already in place as well as in the works to kind of affect the multifamily industry. So looking today, kind of going over an economic overview, what are the fundamentals driving this apartment demand that a lot of the fellow panelists have gone over. I want to talk about what's driving these tight vacancies and what's to come in the future. We also want to look at rent trends. Both Portland and Seattle have had some of the strongest cumulative rent growth this cycle. We definitely want to talk about where things are heading and how this has brought up a conversation about affordability and some of the measures in place as well as proposed to address that, which brings us to the regulatory landscape. And then last but not least, we'll talk about investment activity. We have seen, of course, the relocation the assistance program in Portland, and I believe that's had a huge impact on investment activity from outside players, and I want to show you some evidence of that. I know when I sit through a longer presentation, I like to have takeaways, so we'll have a quick takeaway slide. So looking at fundamentals, I'm going to do a shameless plug as well here. All these pictures on the title slides, the aerials, are taken from CoStar's airplane. We acquired a plane about 2 years ago that flies around every major metro at least twice a year. So this was taken on a very sunny Seattle day, and you can kind of see some of the changes. A lot of stuff has been added since then even. So looking at employment growth, we see here on the left side of the graph, you're going to see employment growth year over year as it relates to the solid lines. Portland is going to be in orange and Seattle is going to be in blue. And then on the right side of the graph, we have the unemployment rate with the dashed lines for each respective color. What we see here is really robust employment growth year over year for really the course of the whole cycle, but especially in 2015 and 2016. This was particularly evident in the Seattle Metro, where you have really warp speed expansion in tech mostly, and particularly Amazon. We also see subsequently unemployment consistently tightening, and we're still pretty much considered full employment, and you can see the levels just going down in both metros there. Now, we can't really talk about employment growth in the Pacific Northwest, specifically these two metros, without talking about migration trends. I know a lot of the other panelists referred to population growth, and both metros have seen really robust levels in that. On the left side of the graph, you're going to be seeing the number of residents as it corresponds to each color in the bars. So the light blue is representing net migration, so kind of looking at move-ins versus move-outs, and then the natural population growth will be in royal blue. And what we see here is that the population growth here is highly attributable to folks moving from other states. A lot of them are moving from places like California, and I think that's had a really big impact on the apartment industry, as a lot of you have seen on the ground. We did see a pretty sharp decline in population growth in 2017, but levels are still far higher than the national average in Portland. And moving on to Seattle, we see a similar but kind of different picture as well. A lot of the population growth is attributable to net migration, just like it is in Portland, but we've seen kind of consistent upticks in levels. Around 70% of all population growth in Seattle can be attributed to net migration for 2016 and 2017. You'll notice that the yellow line didn't go down as much. I mean, we did see some softening in population growth, but nothing compared to the population growth softening in the Portland Metro. Also notable is that Seattle has seen a very large onslaught of high-income households moving to the metro. That's a big difference from Portland. You'd have a lot more kind of an established tech industry, especially with Amazon, and some of the highest paying employers in the metro are garnering talent from other parts of the country. So looking at this, how does this all relate to apartment fundamentals, right? When we're looking at market rate housing. This is looking at demand and supply. Supply will be in orange, so that's the number of units, market rate units added each year. And then blue is going to be net absorption. So pretty much think of it as move-ins versus move-outs for those respective units. What we see here is that Portland definitely had a very large onslaught of supply this cycle, especially since 2014 or so. 2015 and 2016, we had a considerable amount of supply. Notice the circle there. Supply definitely outstripped demand, and this was particularly evident in the urban core, where we saw a lot of negative rent growth and an uptick in vacancies, which affected the overall metro level, as you can see there. Vacancy has since stabilized around the 6% range. I know the numbers are slightly different from the report, but that's mainly due to the differences I alluded to with what we're considering as the units covered there. But vacancy has stabilized around the 6% range or so, still slightly under the national rate. Moving on to Seattle, you do see a similar trend, a lot of supply being added during the same period of time, 2014 and onward. The biggest difference is Seattle was able to absorb the supply a lot better than Portland was. And we can see that with 2015 and 2016. You'll notice that vacancy actually remained well below the national average. You did not see that uptick that Portland had in the previous slide. Now, we did see a slight uptick in vacancy in 2017 for the Seattle Metro, highly attributable to the urban core where you have a lot of high rises kind of being delivered within walking distance of Amazon HQ, mostly in Denny Triangle, downtown, and South Lake Union. And that has definitely put supply pressure on vacancy in those areas specifically, and actually led to the first rent level decrease in the Seattle Metro in about 8 years or so. So that's definitely a red flag for the oncoming supply when we have tens of thousands of units slated to deliver the next few years. Now, looking at rent trends, we definitely have an idea of how vacancies are being affected. We want to look at the overall rent trends this cycle. Now, this one is a little bit different from the previous slides. We kind of combined the two metros in one. Again, Portland is in orange, and then Seattle is going to be in blue. And the right side of the graph is going to look at the bars, looking at year-over-year rent growth, and the lines will represent the left side of the graph, which is asking rent levels. And what we see here is that Portland actually was far outpacing Seattle's rent growth in 2015. As a matter of fact, Portland had the strongest rent growth in the country in 2015 for all major metros, which was definitely, I think, kind of the precursor to a lot of the legislation that we're seeing enacted as well as proposed. But we'd like to mention that the tides have turned quite a bit since then. As you'll notice, Seattle was able to maintain much more robust rent growth in the face of supply pressure. Portland's actually had some of the strongest rent growth deceleration of any metro in the country. And I think a lot of that can be attributed to, of course, the amount of supply being added, which we've talked about a lot today, but also the regulations, which we'll get into a little more detail here. So looking at rent growth, it's nice to know, right, how much rents have gone up, what the year-over-year rent increases are, but it all doesn't mean anything unless you look at incomes. And if you look at Portland here, you'll see in orange cumulative rent growth for the cycle, and then comparing it to the income growth in gray there. And their overall spread is around 5%. You know, the gap was definitely widened significantly in 2015 when we had the strongest rent growth in the country. So 5% is pretty significant if you think about it over a 7 or 8 year period or so. Move on to Seattle, you'll see a much more sharp trend, very similar trend, but much more pronounced. And this has kind of consistently gone up, and despite the fact that rent levels actually did go down in Seattle, the cumulative increase is about 12%, right? 12% spread between rent growth and income growth during that time period. So more than double Portland's rate. But it's definitely good to put these things in perspective that rents are rising a lot faster than incomes in both places, and these are places that have strong income growth. Now, looking at the regulatory landscape, this is a picture that was not taken from the plane, clearly. This is from Portland City Hall. It was, kind of taken when renter relocation assistance became permanent about a month or two ago. So that was a cool little picture there. So these slides will have a lot of information on them. With the interest of time, and everyone needs to get back to work. I just kind of give a little summary, but basically I know a lot of people have talked about rent control in both Portland and Seattle, and I think it's interesting to kind of look at both places. They have similar laws in place. They're both mandated at a state level, right? Oregon and Washington State both have moratoriums on rent control that had been in place since the 1980s. Since the 1980s, you've definitely seen a lot of push at the legislature on a state level to give local jurisdictions to impose rent control. And what we've seen is that Portland and Seattle, the way that the city council has worked for the past few years, has definitely addressed this affordability crisis that we alluded to earlier. And if that ever does get removed, the moratorium at a state level, I think Portland and Seattle are ready to pass rent control, really. But that is a big if. The moratorium is, there have been many pushes to remove it, but it hasn't happened. And then, in the absence of rent control, what kind of things are the cities doing? I want to explore that a little bit. What we noticed is that Portland, of course, we have the mandatory rent relocation assistance law applying to the city of Portland. I'm sure many of you have dealt with this on the ground. I've just studied it in theory, so I'll go through some of the summaries there. And basically what it's saying is that landlords are required to compensate tenants for no-cause evictions or annual increase in rent of 10% or more. And this is kind of the table that allocates it based on unit type. So anywhere from studios or single-room occupancy units, around $2,900 for relocation assistance, all the way up to 3-bedroom or higher, which can be up to $4,500. So you can see how that definitely affects the bottom line in a place like Portland. When you look at the highlights of this law, they pilot tested the program in 2017. Part of the pilot test, they actually exempted owners with only 1 unit, but because it became permanent in March, they're actually going to include owners with 1 unit. So you can imagine how many mom and pa's own 1 unit, maybe a condo or some kind of flat that is going to be mandated under this law. And then looking at the no-cause evictions, you can see that the time period is pretty tight, right? The landlord has to pay the tenant within 45 days of doing a no-cause eviction. Looking at the annual increases, it gives the tenant 45 days to let the landlord know that they're being forced out of their unit due to the 10% or more increase in a year. And then the landlord has 31 days to give the notice to pay relocation costs to the tenant. Now, another interesting thing that's become, I think, kind of a very talked about subject recently is that landlords do have to report when they pay relocation costs, relocation assistance. So there is going to be a database of this information in the city of Portland. Now, looking at Seattle, we don't have any laws on the books for relocation assistance as it applies to annual increases yet. But there is a well-known council member in Seattle named Kshama Sawant who has proposed a bill very similar to Portland's, right? And it's going to only apply to annual increases of 10% or more. It won't apply to no-cause evictions because there are already other laws like that in place in Seattle. But basically, it requires to pay 3 months of rent for anyone that faces a 10% annual increase in rent and is forced out of their unit. Still kind of in the preliminary stages, but we'll see how it all plays out in the next couple years. Looking at the highlights of that law, City of Seattle does have some requirements as it applies to 10% increases, but they're not related to relocation. You have to give 60 days notice as a landlord if you raise your rent by 10% or more. And then you look at the ordinance as it is proposed, it only apply to those making 80% of AMI or less, which is around $72,000 a year for a family of 4 in Seattle, in the city limits. And then there is an existing law I kind of want to cover. It's somewhat similar, but it basically entitles a tenant making less than 50% of AMI to be compensated $3,658, a very specific number. I don't know how that formula is calculated, but it's due to a demolition, a renovation, or a land use change that forces the tenant out of their unit. And that has been in place since 1990. So you can see there are already a lot of laws in place that are similar, but none of them have really covered the fact that a landlord has to pay relocation assistance to Seattle. And I think Portland kind of serves as an example of what may happen in Seattle if it ever does gain headway. And I want to talk about that as it relates to investment activity. Doing a lot of studies on Portland versus Seattle in terms of sales volume. And what you can see here is that since 2013, really, both metros have seen continuous upticks in sales volume for market rate apartment units all the way through 2016. In 2016, we did have record sales volume for both Portland and Seattle for the cycle. Seattle actually recorded around $5.5 billion in volume, highly attributable to foreign and institutional investment from outside of the state. And then Portland, similar story, a little less than $3 billion in volume. But I do want to point out some interesting trends here. From 2015 to 2016 in Portland, about a 33% increase in sales volume. That was especially at the time when rent growth was the strongest in the country in 2015. I think Portland kind of got on the radar for a lot of outside investors. Seattle was kind of already on their radar, but you did see an increase, 22% increase to that record cycle level of $5.5 billion. But we want to look at the timing of this, right? Renter relocation law was passed and enacted in 2017. It's now permanent. And I want to show the difference in volume from 2016 to 2017 to kind of show how that law might have affected outside investment. So you see here that Portland actually decreased around 46% in sales volume from 2016 to 2017. That's just a huge number. That was a national trend, a decrease in volume due to some of the things the economists alluded to earlier, which is interest rate hikes, and of course where we are at in the cycle, but nothing like 46%. Seattle presents a similar picture to the national level, which is more around 20% or so, that decrease. So you can see laws like this definitely can have an effect on volume, especially as it pertains to outside institutional investors in a place like Portland. In 2018, this is volume as of the end of March. Portland is actually on pace to exceed 2017 hangover year, but 2018 for Seattle is looking a little different. We're on pace to be a little bit lower than 2017 volume. However, in a place like Seattle where properties can sell for $700,000 a unit, there might be some deals that move the needle quite a bit. So remains to be seen, but as of now, all else being equal, that's kind of how it stands for 2018. And a little bit takeaways. I know there's a lot to throw at you in 15, 20 minutes, so kind of a little summary here. Strong economic growth has definitely driven apartment demand and very tight fundamentals in both Portland and Seattle. The mass inflow of high-paid residents in Seattle has contributed to a market where the new supply has been able to be absorbed a lot quicker than Portland, as we saw in the vacancy chart and the corresponding rent growth charts. Cumulative rent growth is strong in both places, as is the case with a lot of Pacific Northwest markets, and I think that has raised the conversation, and they have come up with all kinds of different ways to address affordability. We've seen how the renter relocation assistance law in Portland can affect things. I know that Christy and Scott also talked about the inclusionary zoning, which I didn't want to get into, but that's another thing that's had a huge effect on the market here. And the real question is, will Seattle follow the same path when it comes to renter relocation assistance laws? And it remains to be seen, but I think Portland serves as a good example of what can happen if it ever does get enacted. And that concludes my presentation. I knew it was a little quick and a lot of information, but please feel free to contact me. This is my contact information. I'm always available. Thank you.
Our entire office specializes in multifamily real estate, making HFO the largest multifamily brokerage in the Pacific Northwest. Your success is our passion. Build your legacy with HFO. Call 503-241-5541 or visit our website at hfore.com for more information.